Well, it's a great pleasure to be here before you again, and I want to thank you again for your interest in my work and for taking the time to come and hear my thoughts. The previous lecture was called Moral Sentiments and Material Interests, and I guess a good number of you were here for that lecture. Some of you weren't. I'll say one or two things about it. The lecture today is outlined there, and there'll be a third lecture on next Monday, which, with some liberties I took with Rousseau, who said something somewhat similar to the title of the last lecture, but not quite the same. Now, let me say a couple of things about what I did last time, because there are some faces here that I didn't see before. I began citing Machiavelli from the Discourses. He said that in designing a republic, the person who wants to order the laws in such a republic must assume that all men are wicked, hunger and poverty make them industrious, and laws make them good. And he didn't mean that laws make them into good people. He meant that laws make them act as if they were good. That's him. This is, of course, quite different from Aristotle, who thought that the job of the legislator is to produce good citizens, among other things. In fact, he said it's the main criterion of a good convention. I introduced Hume, who told the legislator or constitution writer that he ought to suppose in designing a constitution that all people are knaves, and to find a way to harness the knavery of individuals towards the public good, thereby executing a kind of alchemy, turning shabby motives into valued social objectives. And I then also explained how, of course, Adam Smith and economists generally have developed this idea much further. The problem that I introduced was what I called crowding out or crowding in. There was an assumption called separability, in which the idea is that was assumed by Bentham and Smith, implicitly by Hume and others, and that is that one could mobilize the material interest through incentives and taxes and so on without harming the moral sentiments to do a good job as a citizen in any case. The idea that these two things might be somehow connected in this way, the incentives inducing the correct action, but also affecting the values positively or negatively and having an effect on the action that way. Of course, crowding out is when that effect on values is negative, and crowding in is when it's positive. I presented lots of evidence to the effect that that was true. I mentioned the Boston firemen calling in sick when the incentives for them not to call in sick were cranked up, and their pay was docked if they were sick, and they called in sick in record numbers. I closed last time with a passage from Burke, who told us in the Reflections on the French Revolution, the age of chivalry is gone, that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and that's what I want to talk about today, the dire consequences of this new era. I also introduced many experiments. I won't even say what that one is, because I'm sure you all remember. Now, because the title's Machiavelli's Mistake, and people always ask me, oh, what's the mistake? It's this, that there exists some set of material incentives, taxes, market prices, subsidies, and so on, which can implement a socially desirable outcome irrespective of individual preferences. That's the idea. Of course, I don't attribute that particular idea to Machiavelli, but rather he was one who shifted the attention of thinkers about politics away from producing ideal citizens and towards the idea of taking citizens as they are, as Machiavelli said, those with the natural humors of ordinary citizens. An advantage of this position is, of course, that it allows you to dispense almost entirely with virtue as a problem, and also then avoids the embarrassment of having to make the creation of virtue a part of public policy, which is, of course, deeply troublesome to most liberals. It's mistaken, I said at the beginning of the last lecture, and I'll complete this on Monday. It's mistaken because virtue is not dispensable, it's indispensable. The reason for that is that many contracts are incomplete, and therefore there's no way contracts are incomplete, and the subsidies and taxes and so on that are designed to correct that are necessarily limited in a liberal society. I'll explain on Monday why they're so limited by liberalism itself, and it's a good thing that they are, I would say. And as I say, the problem is that the incentives may actually have an effect on diminishing the virtues, thereby intensifying the problem. Now, I want to ask here, is Mandeville's mistake mistaken for a third reason, one I haven't considered yet? And that's that liberal society actually destroys itself. The use of incentives and so on actually is a non-reproducible policy. So here's the idea, here's the Parasite Hypothesis. I'm going to define liberal society by societies which make extensive use of markets, equality of political rights, rule of law, public tolerance, much attenuated ascriptive barriers to mobility. And I'll say this just in contrast to other societies which I'll call traditional or non-liberal, and you'll see by my reference to particular societies which I have in mind. I don't have any particular, I mean, of course we could define these things somewhat differently. All I need is a group of countries here and a group of countries that are not liberal in that sense. The Parasite Hypothesis says that liberal societies depend on a substrate of virtues. I named some of them there with reciprocity, altruism, and so on. These are perpetuated by traditions, families, other traditional institutions, which are jeopardized by the liberal institutions themselves. So essentially the mobility, tolerance, markets, and so on destroy the traditional institutions on which the virtues depend, those virtues being necessary for the functioning of liberal institutions, including the polity, markets, and so on. So that's the hypothesis. Now, you might ask, well, look, economists have said forever that markets economize on virtues. So why would we care? Suppose the use of markets totally obliterated virtues. Is that really a problem? Now, of course, I'm just asking you to think abstractly here because many of us would take it to be a problem for some other reasons than the functioning of markets and so on. But let's look at how this reasoning goes. Here's Hayek. He says that a market system is one in which bad men can do very little harm. Or here's Buchanan, another Nobel Prize winner in economics, describing purchasing fruit at a fruit stand near Blacksburg, Virginia, where he lives. I don't know the fruit salesman personally. I have no particular interest in his well-being. He reciprocates this attitude. I don't know, and I have no need to know, whether he's in the direst of poverty, extremely wealthy, or somewhere in between. Yet the two of us are able to transact exchanges efficiently because both parties agree on the property rights relevant to them. So here's an idea of an individual who is absolutely indifferent towards his fellow citizens, but somehow things work pretty well anyway, as long as this assumption of complete property rights is given. Now, I said in the last lecture, of course, that's a big assumption, that's a big problem. So this idea of eliminating virtue, and just by cranking up the incentives, runs into two objections. You can never economize so much on virtue that you can get along without it. In some cases, the methods which would be used to economize on virtue, the incentives, actually destroy the virtue so that the incentives backfire. And in some cases, the market-like arrangements may just compromise these virtues in such a way that the society becomes unstable. That instability idea is the Parasite Hypothesis. The previous one was about, incentives backfiring. But I want to look now at a long historical period and say, well, what would be the long trajectory of a society constituted by these institutions which I call liberal, but depending on the values which I've referred to. Now, as I say, many people have said such a thing. They're as varied as Burke, Tocqueville, Marx, and Engels. I won't read these quotes to you. I'm sure you know them all. But they're basically saying similar problems. Daniel Bell's Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism was a famous book 30 years ago. The historic justification of bourgeois society in the realms of religion and character are gone. The lack of a rooted moral belief system is the cultural contradictions of this society. And by the way, because I was myself trained in the major that Ian referred to, it was then called politics, political and economic institutions. I, of course, read all of these guys as an undergraduate, including Schumpeter, Polanyi, and all these other people. And in various passages, they say very similar things. I won't bore you with that. Now, remember, I'm not promoting this hypothesis, or at least not yet. I'm investigating it. So you'll have to bear with me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that there's some evidence that it might be true. I'll propose a model in which it is true, and then we'll ask, should we believe this? So let's start with some evidence for it. We're going to go to Ghana. These are workers in Accra, where we've done experiments of the following kinds. The Dictator Game, you'll remember, is a game in which an individual is assigned provisionally some sum of money, which he or she may give to the other individual, the respondent. That's the end of the game. Nothing else happens. It's just interesting to see how much people give. Now, there's an interesting variant on that, which is called the third-party punishment game, which is there's the dictator as before, there's the passive respondent as before, but now there's a third party who is an onlooker. And the onlooker knows how much the dictator got, knows how much he or she gave to the other person, and can, if she wishes, take some money out of her pocket and pay to punish the dictator for being insufficiently generous to the respondent. You get the idea? So that's the respondent doesn't do anything ever. It's just the third party can impose a cost if the offer is thought to be unfair. Now, the interesting thing here is that in the dictator game, there are no incentives. You just do what you do. In the third-party game, of course, there are, because you're likely to be fined if you don't give enough. So you have to look at that situation and say, well, geez, how much can I get away with, and how much will the fine be, and so on. In Ghana, the people there, these are bakers and men sewing pinafores, little dresses for kids. They gave 30% more in the dictator game than they gave in the third-party punishment game. Okay, you get why that's a surprise? They should have given more in the third-party punishment game, because in the third-party punishment game, whatever motive they had for giving to the other person would now be supplemented additively, presumably, if the separability assumption is correct, would have been supplemented by the inducement which is provided by the fine. Now, if that's all we found out, I wouldn't be reporting this here. But what we found out in the dictator game is something really quite interesting, which is that attendance at church or in a mosque predicted offers. That is, the people who were more, quote, religious in that sense gave more. The economic circumstances of the individuals mattered not at all. They were statistically insignificant, and their coefficients were very small. Now, in the third-party punishment game, with the addition of incentives, the reverse was true. The religious variables had no explanatory power at all. They were insignificant, and they were tiny in size. And all of a sudden, the economic circumstances of the respondent became important, how much income they had, how many kids they had, and so on. Well, what do you think about this? One possible interpretation certainly came to my mind right away, is that the presence of the incentives had somehow changed the way of thinking about the problem, from one in which one's religious values were salient, if one was religious, and that induced you to give more, to one in which religious values were no longer salient, but whether you needed the money became salient, or something about your economic circumstances. This is precisely the kind of experimental result which you would expect to find if the parasite hypothesis were true. Well, let's see what it would mean if it were true. This is a model of the hypothesis. It consists of exactly two equations, two lines. I promise you there will be no more than two. But I ask you to pay attention to how they work, because I think we get a rather interesting result by following this. So we have, this is a problem which I think you understand is one of the hardest problems in the social and behavioral sciences and in history, which is, how do we explain the joint evolution of individual preferences and social institutions? That is, things at the group level and things at the individual level, in some kind of dynamic involving both moving over time. They obviously influence each other, and these two equations, you won't be surprised to know, one reflects the influence of the institutions on the people, and the other reflects the influence of the people on the institutions. So I'm going to just look at the aggregate relations that come out of the model. I'm not going to start with the individual choices and so on. This may be anathema to some of you in economics, but I don't think that it's always insightful to start with the individuals and then build up these aggregate relations. I've done that, but I will show you just the aggregate equilibrium relationships. So virtue on the, given that virtue essentially economizes, markets economize on virtue, then it's the case that virtue expands the domain of mutually beneficial exchanges. That is, sorry, I said that wrong. The more virtue there is, the more you can have mutually beneficial exchanges, because you don't have to have complete contracts. A handshake will do, or maybe eye contact. So lots of stuff that you couldn't transact without the eye contact or without the handshake will happen. Now, I show that here. Here's virtue. By the way, anybody who complains that virtue is multidimensional, you have to be ready to go with me into three-dimensional graphs, or 5 or 10, right? So let's just not even have that conversation. I'm saying suppose there were a single dimension, and I can assure you that if I included 10 dimensions of virtue and two or three dimensions of markets, we would get the same qualitative results. So here we have the extent of markets. What fraction of all of the things that are moved around the society, how is the division of labor coordinated? What role does the markets have in that? Those of you who are economists will know the problem was posed by Coase in the 30s when he said, do firms decide to produce something or to purchase it? Well, the boundary of the firm is an example of the boundary of a market. Here we have more market role, less market role, and more of these virtues. And what this says, this function here says, the level of market use in a society will be greater in a society the less there is virtue. And the idea is this. Markets have a comparative advantage in working with people of, as Machiavelli said, normal and ordinary humors. So if that's what we have, you better have markets as opposed to other things like gift exchange or some other kind of procedure for coordinating the division of labor. This expression here just says that the slope of this thing is negative. The more virtue you have in the society, the more will the members of that society, like the firms in Coase's argument, or like any individuals deciding on whether or not to expand the scope of a market or not, it will be such that we have this downward slope. Now, what are these things here? That is an isoquant that gives you the level of income or net surplus in the society associated with each of these, any point on this. These are isoquants, meaning every point on that top little dish-shaped thing has the same level of income. This one is higher than that one in income because the virtues contribute to being able to make transactions work, which wouldn't be possible in their absence, quoting Kenneth Arrow from the previous lecture. Now notice what I've done. I've done something a little fancy here. This is a locus of points. That line is a locus of points in which the isoquants are flat. Well, what that means is, suppose you have that much virtue in this society right there. Well, then how much markets should you have? Well, that number there is what maximizes your income. I've just chosen a particular M function. It happens to be one that maximizes the income of the society. I'm not saying that because I believe that's the way things work. That's the way, for example, Ronald Coase would say, in the ideal circumstances, that's the way our institutions would evolve so as to maximize in that manner. I do this because I'll come back to it later, perhaps next lecture, and make use of that particular construction here. But it isn't necessary that we have this income maximizing aspect here. It's rather frosting on the cake for now. Now, the markets crowd out virtue. That's the new line I put up there. What that says is the more markets you have in equilibrium, in a cultural equilibrium in which people are adopting preferences and learning from each other and so on, the less virtue you will have. That's the second part of the Parasite Hypothesis. So this line here says, pick some level of markets. Well then, that's the level of virtues that you'll have spread in the population. When people are engaging in exchanges, some part of the time they're engaging with their family members or with the state or with their residents in non-market relations the rest of the time. It's downward sloping. And there are two parts of this. It's downward sloping in markets, but look, here we have this semicolon and then tau. Tradition is represented by tau. Tau sustains these virtues. It's eroded by markets. But for the time being, I'm going to say hold tau constant. It's just some number. It's just some amount of tradition. We're looking at a particular moment of history, a snapshot, if you will. We'll bring in the effect of the traditions changing in just a minute. Well, Now, every point on this steep curve is an equilibrium in the choice of the extension of markets. Every point on this locus here is an equilibrium in people's updating of their cultures, whether by cultural learning or maybe even genetic or any other means by which we acquire our tastes and our values. A joint intersection of these two functions is a stationary point in the society. In other words, that point there, A, is an extent of markets and a level of values that is self-reproducing. And it's self-reproducing because every point on this line says that the degree of markets is stationary, and every point on that line says the degree of virtue is stationary. And obviously, if both are stationary, you have what is called cultural institutional equilibrium. Now, by the way, none of the authors I wrote about, I mentioned, had this in mind, but I thought to formalize what they were going to say, it would make sense to do that. Let me ask you, are there questions about how this thing works? The whole idea of stationarity and equilibrium on things like culture institutions may be something a little new. I mean, when you look at something like that, you either think maybe it's a religious symbol or it's a supply and demand curve, and you're talking about stationarity of prices and quantities. But there's nothing wrong with applying this to things like cultures and institutions. Would somebody please ask me an uninformed question, and please don't start by saying this may be very dumb. I mean, all right, well, I'll go on. But do ask. I mean, if you don't understand how this works, I really think I can explain it to you, and it's not rocket science. Okay, so here's the parasite model in action. Over time, markets erode tradition. Tradition, remember, sustains the virtues. And so the virtue function shifts downwards. That's what's shown by these lines here. So this society here, which has some degree of markets, over time, through the erosion of the tradition, will have lower and lower virtue lines. That will shift the society to necessarily relying on markets to a larger extent because virtue is being undermined. And by the way, this kind of equilibrium with something which is held constant, sort of hypothetically, is called a temporary equilibrium. It's kind of a low-budget way of explaining what is in fact a much more complex dynamical process graphically. Yeah, Chris.
Sorry. So it might help me to understand a little bit better what's going on. If you could differentiate between what is driving the virtue curve down. Why do markets over time drive the virtue curve down? And how is that different from the downward slope of the virtue curve in the market space?
Okay.
What's the mechanisms that are different?
Okay. The line itself here says, with a given amount of importance of churches and extended families in the society, with that demographic and institutional aspect not changing, if you increase the scope of markets, people will, without abandoning their religion or their family values, will become more self-interested. This shifting down is a longer run thing. That's the only difference is the period of time over which it takes place. But eventually you destroy the churches and the families too. And then you're in an even worse situation. Because those were sort of putting a brake on the extent to which markets encourage self-interest. Yeah?
How would changing the scale of the society, either by, say, population growth, which would maybe require more market relationships as opposed to interpersonal relationships, or by, say, technology that functionally expands the size of that civilization, would that be an effect that might want to belong here?
It would, but I don't think that it would illuminate one way or the other, pro or con, the parasite hypothesis. Although, actually, to tell you the truth, I am going to come back to exactly your point about scope when I deal with Adam Smith. So I think my answer may have been incorrect. I think that I don't know exactly how to modify this with respect to scale, but you'll see exactly where it's going to come up later. And probably you'll have an idea then about how to do it. Okay. Well, here's a funny picture, but there's nothing wrong with it. Suppose the functions look like this. Well, how can they look like that? Why not? All I've showed you is that they're both downward sloping. If they're both downward sloping, it's accidental if they intersect only once. They can intersect any number of times they want. Now, these two functions are the same. Here we have the values function, and that's the market function. Up here, we have an equilibrium in which we have a very virtuous society with very little markets. And down here, we have the opposite. I don't expect all of you to intuit what about the middle one, but the middle one is unstable. If you take out a piece of paper and you write down the arrows about where it's going to go from every point in this space, it's called a vector field, and this is a state space of a dynamical system. That equilibrium there is a saddle point. And you will be pushed away from that by any small perturbation. So the society could be here or it could be there. Now, let's bring into effect the historical or long-term effects of tradition on this society. That as the tradition decays, first we move, suppose we start there. We move from that, then we move down a little bit. And you see what happens if you keep moving that function downward. Eventually you destroy the upper intersection. It disappears. So at a certain point, you get down to about there, and then you go precipitously all the way down to B, the lower equilibrium. That's the collapse part of the Parasite Hypothesis. That's how you could have a long-term stasis of liberal democratic capitalism, let's say, followed by a radical collapse operating over a period of a generation or even less. So, in other words, I think the thesis can be written down in ways that are perfectly coherent, and I can provide you with data which would suggest that some of these things are probably true. So should we take it seriously? Should we follow Burke, Tocqueville, Daniel Bell, and others? Well, surprisingly, I actually did some experiments that produced quite a surprise for me. These are Hadza hunters with whom I actually hunted in Tanzania. We played the ultimatum game. Almost all of you know it, so I'll run quickly through this. There are two subjects. One is the proposer. He or she's given some sum of money, offers it to the other person, some part of it, any part from 0 to the whole thing. The respondent can accept or reject. If the responder accepts, that's the end of the game. If the responder rejects, that's also the end of the game, but both parties get 0. And I think you probably share my interpretation that if you find people accepting offers of, say, $20 when the person had 100 to give, it's probably because they're pretty irritated that they didn't get a fair share, and that's a common interpretation of the game. Now, a group of us did experiments in 15 small-scale societies, including hunter-gatherers and pastoral societies, agricultural, horticultural, small-scale agriculture, and so on. The places that we did these experiments are all there, but you notice there's Detroit and LA and Zurich. Those are not small-scale societies. That's where we pre-tested this. We pre-tested the thing. Well, here's a funny picture. This is the offers in the ultimatum game, normalized, obviously. It's how generous the respondent was. This is a measure of the degree of market involvement of the societies in which we did the tests. I'd be happy to explain to you how we got those measures. I think they're probably pretty good. These are ordinal measures, however, so they're, you could have a rather different picture of this if you, but it'd be almost impossible that you didn't have a positive relationship. The more marketized societies are the more generous. And by the way, in case you're curious, in the more marketized societies, people rejected unfair offers much more frequently. So it looks like the market is doing the opposite of what the Parasite Hypothesis is saying. But I'd like to point out here, these are extremely low levels of market involvement. These are people who literally, I mean, they buy and sell things hardly ever, except for, well, the Lamellera. These are whale hunters. They actually sell some of their meat and so on. But it's basically, these are way outside markets. Now, let's try a better test. Public goods game. You remember the public goods game? It's an n-person prisoner's dilemma. You play the game anonymously. You can contribute to the pot, whatever's in the pot, or you can keep your money yourself. Whatever's in the pot, after it's gone around, is doubled or tripled by the experimenter and divided equally among all parties. The dominant strategy in the game, meaning the strategy that a selfish individual would undertake, irrespective of what anybody else does, is you don't contribute any. Well, here we have These are German subjects, and they start out by contributing a little more than 6. And these are rounds, and they end up contributing very little at the end. But they do try to, they give it a try at the beginning. This is a stranger treatment. In each period, their group is eliminated, and they start with another. So in period 1, there's one group playing. In period 2, you're playing in a different group. So there's no motive for behavior modification here. At the end of period 10, the experimenters, Fair and Gechter, say, OK, we're going to play by different rules now. At the end of each round, you're going to see who contributed what. And you can take some money out of your pocket, and you can fine them. Of course, the word fine would never be used, but you can deduct their payoffs. Well, we start there. Notice they start a little higher, not much higher. The prospect that there's punishment out there can be a problem. And you got a dramatic increase here in the contributions. And as I said, there's a nice puzzle here, which is people are very generous when it comes to punishing. They can sustain punishing in a group, but they can't sustain the cooperation. But when punishing is possible, then they generously punish. They solve the public goods game of punishing when they couldn't solve the public goods game of contributing. I'll come back to that in my last lecture, because I think we can extract from that some wisdom for how a policymaker ought to think about economic policy. Well, this game was played in 15, different 15, by the way. For some reason, all these things come in 15s. Played in these societies around the world. These are all student populations, and they're none of them small-scale societies. This is the same picture I just gave you of the first part of the game, where you see the declining contributions. And then here's when you add the punishment, you sustain the cooperation. So in every single one of those societies, you replicate what you find in the single ones, which is it unravels without punishment. It's sustained if you have punishment. People punish rather avidly in these games. Now, that sounds great so far, except that there's what's called antisocial punishment. In most subject pools, when you limit the time frame to just the period that we have, 10 periods, the treatments in which they're not allowed to punish, they actually end up with higher payoffs than the ones in which they are allowed to pay offs. In other words, having the cooperation decline is not as bad for payoffs as it is having everybody punishing everybody, because that's very expensive. And there's a lot of counter-punishment and so on, what they call antisocial punishment. Here we have, the authors call this antisocial punishment. On the left-hand side, you're punishing people who contributed less than you. On the right-hand side, you're punishing people who contributed the same amount as you or more. Take a look at Athens. Or, look at Athens. As much of the punishing was people who did the same as you or more. An interpretation of this is that, suppose I got punished, then what do I infer? Well, I infer it was one of those goody-goodies who was contributing a lot to punish me. This was a partner treatment. This was not a stranger treatment. So what do I do next period? I punish that guy. I find out who, and it happens very avidly. But there's an interesting pattern here. The ones that really, these ones here who really learned how to make it work properly, here we have the payoffs relative to what happened when punishment wasn't allowed. So these ones here learned how to do it. By the end of the game, they were doing great. These ones here didn't. And what's the difference? Well, it turns out that Boston, Copenhagen, Melbourne, Nottingham, St. Gallen, Chengdu, Seoul, and Zurich are the top performers in figuring out how to do this. And the other ones didn't work out. Well, except for Chengdu, it's in China, Seoul, it's pretty obvious what that list is. Basically, well, I don't know what you want to call it, but I would call those liberal societies with the two exceptions that I mentioned. Let me say more about my interpretation of that. Those who didn't work it out got engaged in these vendettas, these arms races. The public goods with punishments, that's the PGWP game. The highest average contributions were the ones here, and the lowest are the ones you can see, Athens, Riyadh, Muscat, and so on. this happened last time, and some people thought I should learn my lesson. But I did. I just unplugged what I now know is called a dongle. I didn't know I had one, but now we do it by hand. I suppose we could do it a little more efficiently this way. I know those of you who were here last time know that last time it took us, how long? 7 minutes to do this. The average contribution levels in the game with punishment correlated very highly with measures of such things as you would consider to be part of a liberal society, like rule of law, democracy, individualism, and social equality. Social equality is roughly whether you call your boss by the first name. I mean, I'm just kidding a little bit, but there is an international measure of interpersonal relationships of equality in symbolic things like how you address them and so on. So you can see basically the ones who are really doing this thing are the liberal societies, the ones who are succeeding in this game, which I think is a pretty good prototype of a game of citizenship, contributing and also upholding the norms of the public. Antisocial punishment is likewise extraordinarily positively correlated, negatively correlated with these measures of what I call liberal society. What does this tell us? It seems to be leaning pretty heavily against the Parasite Hypothesis, because the basic idea of the Parasite Hypothesis seems to be disproved. The liberal societies seem to be doing quite a bit better by this measure of civic virtue. And by the way, I don't mean this is the only measure one could use, but I would be happy for anybody to propose any measure that you will defend and find a different result. I haven't found one yet. Well, this idea then suggests that, maybe Montesquieu and Smith were right, that market exchange, produces these benign effects on human behavior and human morals by this mechanism, which is referred to as du commerce, because it was Montesquieu who first said that the commerce sweetens or softens manners. So here's Voltaire, a wonderful exponent of this view. Enter the Exchange of London, that place more respectable than many a court. You will see there agents from all nations assembled for the utility of mankind. The Jew, the Mohammedan, the Christian deal with one another as if they were of the same religion, and they give the name infidel only to those who go bankrupt. Here's Montesquieu, a slightly more reasoned account. It's almost a general rule that wherever the ways of men are gentle, there's commerce, and wherever there's commerce, the ways are gentle. Commerce polishes and softens. That's where the adusi comes from, barbarian ways, and so on. Now, of course, reading these guys, I was struck by how none of them said how this happens. I mean, as Montesquieu says, it's a correlation. So I looked until I found, as you know, the lectures on jurisprudence were notes taken by his students, by Adam Smith. Here's his explanation. And if those of you who studied repeated games will understand this is exactly what has now been modeled in repeated game theory. When a person makes perhaps 20 contracts in a day, he cannot gain so much by endeavoring to impose on his neighbors, as the very appearance of a cheat would make him lose. When people seldom deal with one another, we find that they are somewhat disposed to cheat, because they can gain more by a smart trick than they can lose by the injury which it does to their character. That's a pretty decent argument. I'll consider it shortly. He did say that ambassadors were likely to be a little shady and to cut corners, and I decided to look into that. So I took a measure. I found out the number of unpaid parking tickets of the diplomats at the United Nations. Deadbeat diplomats. Was Smith right about the diplomats? Well, he certainly was. You would be astounded by the average number of unpaid parking tickets. There is one delegation at the United Nations that averages 147 unpaid parking tickets per diplomat. Now, I mean, you really have to work at that. I mean, you just may have to leave the car in the middle of the street every time you get out of it. I won't say which that is. It's not one of my cherished liberal countries. But I did decide to, just for fun, measure the parking tickets against various measures of liberalism, if you will. This one here is, these are the top 25 rule of law, and these are the remaining 100 or so in rule of law. This is the top 25 in terms of a measure of democracy and so on. There's vast differences. I mean, now you may ask, well, maybe it has to do with anti-American sentiment, maybe the cost of paying a ticket is greater to the other countries and so on. You could play around with the data, but you're never going to make it go backwards. You're never going to make it come out right for the Parasite Hypothesis. Now, Smith rightly said in that passage about repeated interactions that markets are a kind of school. They're a place where we learn things, where we adopt certain character traits and abide by them. He was saying we do it for reasons of self-interest, but they lead us to act in ways which we refer to as virtues. Now, this is, of course, a big topic, but I think I would like you to entertain the idea that an economic environment, like a market or a firm, is a cultural environment. It's a learning environment. It's a learning environment because basically it determines who you meet with what probability to do what's your strategy sets or what your activities that you do with which kind of payoffs. So if you're the kind of person that's copying others according to whether or not they're doing well in terms of their payoffs, a difference in the environment will alter your updating process, leading you to copy one kind of person as opposed to another, depending on the payoffs to these various activities, which of course are strategically dependent on what everybody else does. Now, markets, Smith is right. Markets provide an environment in which if you have long-term repeated interactions, they may have that characteristic of allowing people or giving people a benefit of acting in a moral way towards others because the consequences of retaliation would be sufficiently great. But it's hard to say that markets would do this more than other institutions, which is, of course, the important fact. Here I have two characteristics of institutions. They're either ephemeral or they're durable. They're either anonymous or they're personal. So I was trying to ask myself, what are markets really like? Well, I think what markets are like psychologically is that they're anonymous and ephemeral. Now, I don't mean that they're literally anonymous and ephemeral. I may know the name of the guy who I buy gasoline from, but I don't need to. And I may go back to him again and again, but I don't need to. It would make no difference in the analysis of the gas market whether I knew his name or went to a different guy every day. So these are what I call markets, and these other things are other ways of organizing an economy, parts of an economy. Now, the way I've described a market here, that's a kind of neoclassical market. It's an ideal type. Smith was talking about markets which were presumably operating at a rather small scale and which people didn't interact with very many people. However, as markets expand, you interact with thousands of people. As mobility expands, you probably don't know or don't have that much interest in knowing very much about some of the people you interact with. Or, as economists advise policymakers to try to, quote, perfect markets, what they're doing is they're making markets into institutions which have no resemblance whatsoever to the markets which were described by Adam Smith as having this du commerce effect, namely markets in which people interact for a very long period of time. You want an example? What is this mantra now? Flexible labor markets. A flexible labor market is a market in which the average worker has a lesser duration of time likely to work with a group of workmates and with a particular employer because it's much easier to fire him now. Flexible labor markets would destroy Smith's mechanism. Now, I would, if I had time, I would give you some examples of that, because I think Smith is absolutely right that some contracts have been enforced by that kind of mechanism, and they tend to be destroyed by the expanding scope of markets. Thank you for that question. I can give you a couple from European economic history. You'll see one is the famous case of the Maghribi versus the Genovese traders. Another is the so-called community responsibility system for contractual enforcement, both of which had this Adam Smithian characteristics, but were obliterated by the growth of markets, the extent of markets. Now, so what's my explanation of these data? Order is maintained in non-liberal societies, in important part by lineage-based segments of the society, that's by families. And I mean something, let me just give you an example to convey the idea. If somebody from Chris's family has stolen one of my animals, or I believe so, then I wouldn't think of, and suppose I suspect it's Chris. Would I try to punish Chris? No way. Somebody from my lineage would go to his group and say, we think Chris is acting badly. Indeed, we think he took one of Sam's animals. And so what are you going to do about it? And that's a very important part of order. What would happen if I went personally to Chris and beat him up or stole one of his animals? I would get all of his brothers and cousins and so on my case, because I would have violated the norm, which is I have no right to maintain order in that lineage. Now, by the way, the story I made up, I don't really know that he took my dog, but I'm drawing on a very rich literature about the way in which order is maintained in segmentary societies. Now, the role of families now have a rather different sense than at the beginning. Families are then a problem for liberal culture. They're not the source of the values, they're rather an impediment. Because essentially, if you rely heavily on family, or on the lineages, these larger numbers, common descent, then you're very much more likely to have for example, a view of reciprocity or trust, which is very particular. You trust people in your lineage, you don't trust anybody else. You'll reciprocate with people who are in your lineage, but not with others, and so on. There's some wonderful work done by Ernst Gellner, the anthropologist, Toshio Yamagishi, the social psychologist, Diego Gambetta, the sociologist, developing the idea that what's happening in the process of the expansion of markets and the expansion of liberal societies is the destruction of these particularistic forms of orders and the substitution by a more general form of order, which we refer to as the rule of law and so on. But I want to emphasize something particular about this. Liberal society does a great job of risk reduction. Now that may seem odd to you because it seems like something in which you're kind of on your own. But the downside, the worst thing that can happen to you, is often quite attenuated by various things that are part of that society. Well, one thing is the rule of law. Basically, it means having bodily harm done to you and having property stolen and so on. It's less likely than in most other societies. Liberal societies are relatively peaceful. But focus on mobility. If you're in a part of the country that's growing a crop that fails in the world market, let's say, if you're in a liberal society, you can easily move someplace else. You're quite mobile. You're not in a caste of people who has to make shoes. You can shift to making something else. So you're not labeled by an occupation or a crop and so on. So the geographical and social mobility allows people to move away from their worst case outcomes. Of course, very recently we have social insurance, but I think that's probably much less important in the larger scale of things than the fact that of the tremendous mobility of individuals occupationally and geographically in a liberal society. And what that does is it makes these family ties relatively unimportant. And what that does is it encourages generosity and reciprocity towards strangers. And that's what I call the civic virtues, or it's a part of what I call the civic virtues, because to make a large-scale modern society work, we don't need loyalty towards our cousins, we need loyalty towards people whose names we don't know. Now, I think I'm going to set aside the crowding in. What I'm arguing here, I would give you, I'll tell you this story, but I won't give you the model. The idea is this. Liberal society makes it okay to trust the other guy. Why? Because the worst he can do to you is not that bad. So think of traffic. Suppose people obey traffic norms as long as almost everybody else does. But suppose there's some just flagrant violators. If those people are effectively fined, and if you know they're going to be fined, even if you see them cutting in and so on, you don't then start cutting in yourself. If you think they're going to get away with it, after a while, you're just like one of those people in the public goods game without punishment. You say, well, hell, they're not contributing, I won't either. So this Yamagishi-Shinada paper is really clever. It's a public goods game in which the following happens. Same public goods game, except on one of the treatments, I go to Bob, but only him, and I say, Bob, everyone else in your group is going to get punished if they don't contribute enough to this. As far as you're concerned, you can go ahead and do whatever you want. No punishment for you. Okay? Now, we know how much he contributed before. And his incentives in this new treatment are identical to his incentives before. He contributes much more, knowing that everybody else is going to be punished. Well, what does that tell you? His material incentives hasn't changed. It's just that he doesn't worry about being a sucker in this situation because he knows that he doesn't have to withhold his contribution to protect his non-sucker status. He's going to be okay as far as that's concerned. Now, of course, what is this? This says, essentially, many liberal institutions have the effect of crowding in virtue. It makes it much more likely you can trust the other guy because you're less likely to be taken advantage of. And the little model here, I'm sure that you would love it. But so let me summarize what I think is going on in these data. In early modern Europe, you have the rise of first absolutist and much later democratic states, representative first, then democratic states, and the rule of law. I'll call that sigma. I put that as a new argument in these functions, and I basically say this, that essentially, by the argument I just said, the crowding in argument, that shifts up the virtue case, makes it possible to act in a trusting way under circumstances in which you wouldn't have acted trusting in the absence of that kind of society. And because of the defense of private property, definition and defense of private property, it allows the greater extent of market. It makes the greater use of markets more efficient. And so therefore we see this symbiotic development of powerful states and market commercial societies. They did not develop in opposition. I hope you know that. They developed synergistically. And you have a shift from that equilibrium to that one there, in which the more marketized societies are also more virtuous. It need not go that way. Play around with the graph a little bit, and you'll see that you could have other kinds of relationships. It does suggest, however, that if some societies are more market-oriented than others, we should see differences in civic virtues in them. That is, we should be able to test that. I can't think of exactly how to test that, not because I can't measure the virtues. You already understand, but I'm perfectly happy to measure those in all kinds of odd ways. But it's actually the hard thing is measuring the extent of the market. Okay, so here's my conclusion. I'm repeating in italics what the hypothesis was. Liberal societies depend on a substrate of virtue, etc. That's true. These values are perpetuated by tradition. That's false. Liberal societies jeopardize these traditional institutions. That's true. And hence the reproduction of the values on which the functioning of liberal society depends. That's false. The argument is that the robust civic society or civil society of the liberal countries or nations, the things I mentioned, kindness towards stranger, generalized as opposed to particular reciprocity and so on, may be indeed undermined by markets. But it's supported by the rule of law and what I call liberal insurance, and it's also supported by the diminished role of tradition and other non-liberal institutions. So the answer to the question is no. That returns us then to Machiavelli's mistake and what to do about it. So we now set aside a third reason why Machiavelli might have been mistaken, and we now have to focus on the first two. The first one says there's no way to make values indispensable. And the second one says incentives may crowd them out, so that if values are necessary and applying higher levels of incentives may have destructive effects, then the public policy maker has a serious problem. So next time, Monday, I'm going to introduce you to an interesting fellow. This is the sophisticated legislator. The sophisticated legislator knows all of this, has taken it on board, he believes it, and he's a very good mechanism designer. He knows implementation theory from microeconomics, and he's going to design incentives with this problem in mind. Now, he has a lot harder problem than Machiavelli's prince or than Hume's knave managing constitution writer or Bentham's legislator or Maskin, social planner for that matter, to mention Eric Maskin, the great mechanism designer of, one of the great mechanism design guys of the present period. In designing how you would approach this, knowing what I'm going to take on board as if it were true, these facts, I think you'll be surprised at some of the results. Some of you may have read a book by Titmuss on blood, paying for blood and the gift relationship. If you pay for blood, people don't give blood, right? I'm sure you've read about that. If you haven't read the book, I'm sure you've read about it. Well, of course, he thought that incentives, that's an indictment of incentives. It's actually quite a bit more interesting than that, and I'll spare you that model too. This is what happens next, and I think and I'd like to thank again all the people that have contributed. I didn't say who all these people are. That's the Santa Fe Institute. That's the University of Siena. That's a group of my research team at the University of Siena and other people visiting. And this is Justice on the town hall wall in Siena, Italy, where I live and work. Thank you very much.